The crimson warning lights blipped across the dark console. Chamber 4 remained silent. A small, perfectly round glass sphere sat jammed in the primary sensor plate. If her proprioception is that perfect, the Velian senses must be glitching. The girl stood perfectly still. Her breathing had not shifted. Meanwhile, the final diagnostic test had cannibalized its own logic circuits trying to read her. I wish I could tell you it was just a system error. It wasn't. Stay close because the real damage hasn't even started. 11 hours earlier, the Velian liquid membrane nodes had been humming calmly. The evaluation wing hadn't processed a new species intake in 11 years. My name is Quillick. I hold a 3-month contract as a simple data archivist. My only job was logging raw outputs from the computation arrays. Thick, translucent pipes carried green liquid across the ceiling, handling parallel processing for the entire academy. Everything was running at baseline. Then the intercom clicked active. Species, human. Planet of origin. Class 12. I first saw her in the intake hallway. A localized gravity anomaly was active. We use isograph shifts to test a new species baseline equilibrium. Most subjects collapse instantly. She didn't. Her name was Gemma. She barely reached the chest plate of the facility guards. She wore a faded, heavily stitched backpack. Her eyes carried a strange, heavy exhaustion. Not the fatigue of a long transit, but the sheer weight of a daily routine. The chief examiner ran the intake scanner. It flagged a dense anomaly in her right pocket. He pulled it out. A small, perfectly clear glass sphere. I logged it officially. Unknown spherical mineral sample. Purpose undetermined. It was a child's glass marble. They confiscated it and sealed it inside a sterile plastic evidence bag. Gemma didn't argue. She just took a slow, calculated breath. Then she stepped onto the primary scanning plate. The Morvathy proctor initiated the passive scan. Morvathy are telepathic thread readers. The proctor linked his mind to Gemma's neural output. The reaction was violent. His skeletal frame locked rigid. A massive wave of overlapping emotional threads overloaded his nervous system. He lost all motor control for 4 agonizing seconds and collapsed hard against the polished floor. Gemma didn't flinch. She simply looked down at him and asked what time the orientation session began. The battery launched. Exam 1 tested logic and pattern recognition. The Varelian system projected a fractal geometry puzzle across the chamber screen. Galactic standards dictate that an average species requires 20 minutes to comprehend the first variable. Gemma stared at the projection. Then she started typing. She bypassed the sequential steps, identified a recursive pattern the evaluators had missed, and solved the entire sequence backwards. The Varelian computation nodes struggled to verify her inverse logic. Chamber 2 activated. The endurance and stress trial. The protocol dictated an immediate drop in oxygen saturation while the temperature plummeted to near freezing. The standard biological response is panic. Gemma's heart rate didn't spike. It dropped. Her body recognized the hostile shift and didn't waste energy panicking. It slipped into a highly regulated state of conservation. Her breathing became shallow and rhythmic. The Velian system flashed 3 simultaneous error codes. Its sensors had no parameters for a species that adapted by slowing down. Chamber 3 initiated. Environmental adaptation. The terrain shifted into a harsh, jagged synthetic landscape. Atmospheric pressure increased rapidly. New species typically spend hours wandering this mock survival zone. Gemma assessed the perimeter in 3 seconds. She walked directly to a thermal outcropping and constructed a perfectly angled emergency shelter using synthetic debris. Took her 4 minutes. Then she walked to the emergency intercom and pressed the red button. "Excuse me." Her voice sounded entirely bored. "I need to file an official complaint. The survival section is heavily unbalanced. The thermal materials are laid out in plain sight," she continued. "The windbreaks are naturally formed. This doesn't feel like an exam." Nobody answered her. The system automatically pushed her into Chamber 4. Toxin identification. The table presented 6 vials of liquid. The objective was to identify the lethal compounds using a chemical analyzer. Gemma ignored the analyzer. She picked up the first vial. Before the chief examiner could trigger the safety override, she lifted it to her mouth. She tasted it. Silence filled the observation deck. She swished the liquid and spat it into the disposal sink. "Heavy metals," she announced. "Tastes like copper and industrial runoff." She picked up the second vial. The Varelian liquid membrane nodes began to boil. The system couldn't process her lack of self-preservation. It didn't understand that a Class 12 biology could sample a mild galactic toxin and categorize it by flavor. Chamber 5 was the reflex and spatial awareness test. Standard protocol was to fire 3 simultaneous projectiles. As soon as the automated turrets locked, Gemma shifted her position. She didn't wait for the projectiles to fire. She had read the turret's internal muscle tension and microvibrations before the attack launched. An ability reserved in the galactic database solely for highly evolved apex predators. 3 flashes, 3 hits. But Gemma wasn't there. She had dodged the projectiles by mere centimeters, and that same strange exhaustion still hung on her face. Her breathing rate remained exactly at baseline. The Varelian system flashed continuous warning lights. Couldn't comprehend how a biological entity could react with such speed. But the biggest shock hit us on Exam 4. The evaluators suddenly realized she had solved Exam 4, a complex optical refraction calibration test, before it even started. When the examiner pulled that glass sphere from her pocket during the intake scan, Gemma had gently rolled the marble across a jammed sensor plate the second she entered the testing room. She had calculated the exact trajectory of that object without even breaking stride. The cold, sharp click of the glass marble on the Academy console was caught by the observation deck microphones at that exact moment. That single, minor physical movement had seamlessly recalibrated the entire optical array. The system's lasers reflected off the marble's curve and locked onto their proper targets. Now the final exam began. Applied physics. Gemma looked at the chair. She adjusted the testing chair to fit her anatomy. She straightened its backrest completely and sat comfortably in front of the console. The system generated a theoretical physics problem. It was a complex formula to stabilize the gravitational pull of a collapsing star, involving quantum fluctuations and temporal distortions. Standard species require multiple hours just to grasp the basic structure of this problem. Gemma stared at the screen, rested her fingers on the console, and began inputting direct variables without a single calculation. Her typing speed was so fast that the console keys blurred. "We learned this in grade school," she said quietly. There was no arrogance in her voice. She was simply stating a fact. The Morvathy Proctor, who had only just regained consciousness, saw her calm clarity and attempted to read her emotional threads once more. He expected to find panic, stress, or at least a mild trace of confusion in her mind during such an intense calculation. But he found only a blinding white light of focus and pure logic. The Morvathy Proctor collapsed to the floor a second time. His motor controls failed completely for another 4 seconds due to the repeated overload. The chief examiner verified the final calculations on his terminal. His hands shook violently over the console. "The math checks out," he whispered. "That's the worst part." The crimson warning lights were still blipping in the dark, but we were finally seeing the full picture. Chamber 4 remained completely silent, and that small glass sphere sat jammed dead center in the primary sensor plate. The final piece that had mentally and physically shattered their entire evaluation system. I stared at the screen where her final input was still displayed. The staff scrambled to pull Earth's planetary files and biological data streams. Data logs rapidly flooded my screen. I started reading those records, and the color of my shelvery ear membranes shifted from dark amber to practically black. It was a state triggered only by the presence of mortal danger. DWD-56. The human visual cortex can process roughly 10 million distinct colors and shades. Their optic nerve is so dense that they detect microvariations instantly. DWD-60. When humans face extreme physical stress, their brain triggers a runner's high, releasing neurochemicals and endocannabinoids that transform absolute exhaustion into pure pleasure and motivation. Their body rewards them for surviving. If her spatial awareness is based on sonar, No, her biology is completely silent. DWD-67. Their proprioception is so deadly accurate that they can perfectly map the position of every limb to within 2 degrees of joint angle without looking. Their internal gyroscope never fails. When she dodged the final projectile, the movement of her body was so precise, so fluid, and so perfectly timed that the chief examiner just stood rooted to his spot, his eyes wide in disbelief. The entire observation deck was left with nothing but the humming sound of the automated defense system that had tried its absolute best to completely neutralize the girl. The truth was completely obvious to us now. Gemma hadn't cheated. Our grand testing battery was designed for species that can process only 50,000 colors, possess a 12-degree proprioceptive accuracy, and perceive any kind of stress as a strictly negative threat. We were judging her against the criteria of species that were absolutely nothing compared to her. The exams were calibrated for the wrong species. A massive red prompt suddenly flashed across the main screen. The Velian database had surrendered for the first time in its entire computational history. It had submitted an official request for manual override. 3 days later, the Academy issued Directive 417. All future screening batteries must include a Deathworld calibrated baseline. Nobody argued. That glass sphere, once considered a simple toy, was now permanently sealed in the Applied Physics Archive. It bore the tag, Demonstration Artifact G1. The evaluation chamber lights dimmed to standby. In 11 years, they had never needed to reset.